or the resource in the capacity that you should be. You know, this is in your job description. Why is this not happening, or whatever? Fulfillment from working with students.
Yeah.
Was he going to introduce me, or do you? Okay.
Good evening, folks. Welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm Matthew Lozier. I teach in biology, and I want to welcome you to our Cowiche Canyon Conservancy and Yakima Valley College Winter Speaker Series. It's wonderful to gather here and talk about the wonders of our natural places. Tonight, I expect we'll hear a story that has evidence and data collection, and I believe that we're all here supporting that general mission of informing ourselves and the people around us. I do want to take an opportunity to let you know that you can also support that here at YVC and support student research. We are having our annual giving campaign coming up middle of April, April 22nd. So if you're interested in supporting student research at YVC, check out our website and do a search for Giving Day. There are opportunities to have your donation matched as well. So thank you for that consideration. I do want to thank our YVC teams. So we have community relations here, live streaming and recording. We have lots of support from our conference center staff and support from our YVC leadership to host this. So thanks to all those folks. If you have not done so already, just make sure your cell phones are quieted for the presentation. And I'll turn this over to Cy from Cowiche Canyon Conservancy.
Thank you, Matthew. My name is Cy Philbrick with Cowiche Canyon Conservancy. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out on a cold and wet Tuesday. I just have a couple housekeeping announcements. But I first just wanted, I already said thank you, but I wanted to genuinely thank just the Yakima community for appreciating talks about science. And we wouldn't be able to put this on if there wasn't a demand and a hunger within our community to come out to events like this. So thank you guys. And also thank you to our speaker this evening for braving Monastash Pass and coming all the way from Central Washington University amidst a very busy schedule to present this evening. Yeah, we appreciate it. One housekeeping announcement is just to use this space for something different each time. We at Cowiche Canyon Conservancy are just about to enter our field trip season, which runs from April through the second week of June. And this year is shaping up to be one of our busiest field trip seasons of all time. I think we're just about full for school signups, which means we have a trip of, for the most part, a whole grade of students that come, so anywhere from like 60 to 115-ish children, elementary through middle school, who show up to Snow Mountain Ranch for an interactive science-based field trip. And we are just starting our recruitment this year for volunteers to help support our field trips. So my pitch to y'all is, if you haven't been asked already to join our field trips, consider it as a way to meaningfully volunteer in science education in our valley. And if you want to talk about what that means, please feel free to grab me after this talk. We also have I'm seeing a number of folks in our audience this evening that have been really valuable field trip volunteers through the years. So if you want to talk to them, I'm happy to point you to other folks as well. Thank you. One more announcement is, so this is the second talk of our winter talk series. The third is coming hot and fast next Tuesday, March 3rd. Same time, same place, Tuesday evening, on the Nelson Dam removal and how that compares to other dam removals in the Northwest, by a colleague of Clay's, Lisa Eli, will be here next Tuesday. So if you're not busy, please come on out. Without further ado, tonight's speaker is Clay Arango. Clay is the chair of the biology department at Central Washington University, and Clay is going to be talking about a scary and surprisingly unknown topic, I think. There's a lot of fear and just hand-wringing and mind-wringing about plastics because a lot of us, myself included, don't really have a grasp of the scale of the issue. And I think that's why we're here tonight, is to embrace fear to some extent and to get a better understanding of what's going on. So Clay, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Just confirming that confirming the audio is okay out there, the microphones are working. Excellent. Well, thank you all for being here. The first shout out I would like to give is actually to Cy, because when he invited me to this talk, he asked me to come up with a good name, and I'm used to very dry scientific names. And I think I might have, if I remember right, I tried to take a stab at it, and Cy very politely wrote back and said, no, that's not gonna work. How about this? So from sweatpants to garbage patch. So hopefully that's the journey we go tonight. I think probably most people have heard about the garbage patch. We're going to work our way backwards up and talk about how the things that we do on the landscape are connected to all of that. And I hope that in doing so, you get a better appreciation for A, how difficult this problem about environmental plastic pollution is, but then also hopefully we can end with at least some small steps that you can take as individuals that can at least help to reduce some of the guilt that you might have about it, because some people do have some guilt about participating in big things like that. So we'll start here in Austronesia with a bowerbird in the lower left, and these are the birds that are, you know, very well known for making elaborate mating structures. And you can see the house that it made in the background to attract the mate. And one of the things that they like to do is to decorate it. And you can see that this bird has gone out and found all sorts of blue bottle caps and weird things that are floating in the ocean or in the landscape to come up to decorate it as an offering. And then on the other side, we see the most polluted river in Indonesia, which is the Kataram River, which is widely considered the most plastic polluted river in the world. And you see a young man, a young boy in this environment. It's probably hard to see because of the low contrast, but in the back of that boat, he's picking out straws from this mess of garbage, and presumably those have value somewhere in a market back on shore. But you can see that literally it's a river of plastic. So how in the world did we get here? A couple of years ago, and this is just for kind of shock value to really draw you in, right? A couple of years ago, some of our environmental colleagues at UBC and UVic up in British Columbia did a study on the human consumption of microplastics. And what they did is they went out and they bought diets from the grocery store, and they had a couple of different assumptions. One might have been that you were eating a very meat-based diet, and one that you were eating a very vegetarian diet. And what they found was that annual microplastic consumption from just diet ranges anywhere from 39,000 to 52,000 particles per year, right? And when you consider the plastic that we breathe in the air, that goes up to 74,000 to 121,000 pieces of plastic per year. And just to do some quick head math, you know, I mean, there's what, 365 days in a year. You divide 52,000 by that number, you're close to 200 pieces of plastic a day, right? So that means, I mean, I'm gonna go to bed in about 2 hours. That means I'm probably about 180 pieces of plastic by now, right? So this is a lot, and a lot of it is stuff that we really don't know, right? Because if you see that image of the salt on the upper right there, there's little fibers that are just present all over the place. Plastic is so ubiquitous that when they found this new species of amphipod at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, so the Marianas Trench is the deepest spot on Earth, an ocean trench off of East Asia, and you can see they named this one Eurythecines plasticus, because if you look over on the right side there, you can see that one of the things they found in one of the most remote environments on Earth is that this piece of, amphipod had a piece of plastic in it, a microfiber. So this really just goes to show you that even though when we think about environmental plastic, the first thing that comes to mind is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. But it's really, we should be talking about this as really a daily and a daily exposure and an environmental exposure that goes everywhere from the atmosphere down to the deepest parts of the ocean. So with that in mind, I kind of want to step through how we think about that and hopefully give you at least a ray of hope at the end, because I'm pretty sure that's not the most optimistic way to start a talk. Plastic. It's useful stuff, right? Everything that we use is made out of plastic. And it was invented, you know, depending on where you draw the line, a lot of people would say it was invented in 1907 because this is the very first synthetic plastic made from raw chemical constituents as opposed to being a natural product that was augmented with those things. And this was invented by Leo Baekeland, and it's called Bakelite. And it was a really useful thing. Here you see some that they're bangles that you can wear, you know, so it was originally used for costume jewelry. It could be made in a lot of different colors. It could be polished. It is made from a phenol formaldehyde resin, and one of the really useful properties about it is it was an electrical insulator. It was a really handy electrical insulator. And so at the time when the United States and the developed world is electrifying, and you know, glass it's easy to make and it's useful, but sometimes it was easier to go to these types of compounds that you could just invent in the lab, make them to fit exactly what you want, and then send them out. It's like it's mass production, right? It's our world right now. And the irony about all of this is that we're now going to be talking about how the world is awash in plastics and the potential possibilities for environmental and human ecological damage, et cetera. But these old pieces of plastic are actually collectibles at this point because of their rarity. And so it's just to me, it's a strange irony that that plastic, which is kind of, you know, synonymous with cheap and discardable and throwaway, but it's also a collectible that can attain some pretty decent values if you happen to have them. So it's kind of one of the great ironies in life. Plastics really picked up in the mid-20th century. One of the big things that initiated high-capacity plastics was the war effort. You know, nylon was a much more useful thing than silk for parachutes. Faster, cheaper to make. Plexiglass and aircraft that could be shaped just the right pieces and things like that that were needed. And the mass production of that particular war effort really put this into mass production, but it really wasn't until the 1960s when plastics became the dominant material that is in use. And I know this is getting to be a dated reference, but hopefully everybody, you know, if you haven't seen The Graduate, you probably should. It's a classic. Dustin Hoffman, much older than that these days. Did he even pass away last year? I can't remember. Anyway. So not long after, plastic became the widespread phenomenon and then also synonymous with that throwaway disposable society. They actually pulled the first plastic bag from the ocean in 1960s, in 1965. So we think about this kind of a modern phenomenon, but plastics have been making their way into the environment for quite a long time. So now we have the plastic conundrum. And in environmental science and in environmental circles, we call this a wicked problem. Because there are so many benefits to using plastic, and there are just as many drawbacks, and that's what makes it really hard to solve, even though most people would really recognize this as a solvable, as a problem that we should be solving. So for example, they're cheap. Because they're cheap, they're used in many products. They're versatile. So you can come up with new and just a huge wide variety of different uses for plastic, right? They're very useful that way. They're resistant. And so that's nice for shelf life because that means they're not going to break down, right? I mean, maybe you've had an experience using the disposable straws, which are handy, right? But you better drink your drink pretty quick, right? Because those things melt pretty quickly. But you don't have the problem with plastic. That's why we use them as straws, because they don't melt when you suck your Slurpee up. You could also not use a straw. That's another option. But if you need to use a straw, they're very lightweight. So when companies are trying to reduce shipping cost, going to plastics is the big one. It was in my 20s when, which would have been, I guess, the early 90s, when the bottling industry went from glass to plastic, right? And one of the big justifications for that was because it reduced shipping cost. Because when they're shipping from a local bottler and they're using glass, and each of those glass bottles weighs, I don't know, however many times more than and it's fuel cost, right? So it seemed like, oh great, we're gonna save some gasoline, save some petroleum, because we're gonna switch to plastic, and that's gonna be a good thing, right? But in the context of environmental pollution, that means that plastic that drops out onto the parking lot out here doesn't just stay there, right? It travels. On a windy day, it might wind up in Spokane. On a wet day, it might wind up behind Bonneville Pool, right? They move because of that. And not only that, but plastic production is increasing rapidly. In the year 2019, there were 400 million metric tons produced. You can see this is what we call an exponential curve. That means that it's going up by a multiple instead of by a simple addition. And when most things that grow exponentially are bad things, right? This would include cancer cells in your body that grow exponentially, and they can make tumors, right? Human population has been growing exponentially, and we all know the dangers and the perils of overpopulation. Well, producing plastic, which, as we just said, is a very resistant thing that resists breakdown, is also a dangerous thing, because what's going to happen to this? Especially because half of it is single use. The lifetime of most plastics that you use is only designed to be about a 5 to 10 minute life of the consumer, right? From the time you open the bottle to drink it to throw it away, from the time you take your bag of groceries home, empty it, and then throw it away. And then that's it. Except that we've made a permanent, essentially permanent item for something that's an extremely mundane disposable use, right? There's some inherent problems in all of that. Of all of this of plastic that is produced in the world, actually the vast majority of it winds up in the garbage, okay? So it's a relatively small proportion that ends up entering the environment and ultimately entering the ocean, but a small proportion of a really large number is still a very large number, right? And so that's kind of where we're at right now. I'm a system guy. I like to think in big pictures. I like to think in terms of movements of things from one place to another, like movements of carbon from the atmosphere into plants for photosynthesis and things like that. And so these types of diagrams are really helpful in trying to think about what's happening with plastic. And you can see here, total primary plastic. This is the sum of plastic produced over this time frame, over the 65-year period. And you can see that the vast majority, I'm pushing too many buttons. The vast majority of that is going over to a landfill. There's a small amount of that primary plastic still in use. You know, your grandmother's sofa, you know, that was bought a long time ago, and the foam is still there, the cushion that, you know, you're still trying to get some life out of, that's plastic that's still in use. Recycling is the answer, right? Here's recycling. Of course, we're going to make that green. And there's your recycling that puts it back into use. And it's just a really, really small amount of all of it. So what we can take home from this message is that recycling rates are very low. And I mentioned that I'm a system thinker. My actual discipline is what we call ecosystem ecology, and we think about, you know, things moving from organic form to inorganic form. So that carbon dioxide that was in the atmosphere that's inhaled by a plant, hopefully in about a month or so as spring picks up, right? It's going to green up. And then at the end of the year, that leaf is going to fall off and die, and then that carbon dioxide is going to go back to the atmosphere, right? So we can think about that as an arrow with these loops that are going around. Water, it's evaporated from the ocean. It blows over the Pacific and over Washington. It's raining right now. It's going down the river systems back to the ocean, right? Those are cycles. This is not a cycle. This is a straight line. And if you wanted to make a straight line out of this, if you wanted to extend this all the way back, this is going into the ground as petroleum. And it's going back into the ground as garbage. But there's nothing that's turning that garbage back into petroleum again. So we're not literally closing the loop, okay? Natural systems close loops, right? Things that are produced by plants or animals decay and return back to the soil. This does not do that, at least not in a biological time span, right, that's useful for us. So this does not work in an ecological setting. So I want to break this apart a little bit, and I'm going to pre-apologize because this can be a kind of an ugly figure to start with, but this is just helping, it helps me as a person who thinks in terms of these boxes and arrows and where things go, to think about what's happening with plastic. And so we can start here with the raw material plastic, which would be a fossil fuel of some kind. And then that goes into some plastic manufacturing process. And the vast majority of that then gets converted to some kind of a consumer good, whether it's the plastic dashboard in your car, or the casing of your computer, or maybe even some of the fibers in the clothing that you're wearing. And then some of that gets recycled because hopefully if you've got a plastic bottle and you're drinking a water bottle, you can put that in the recycle, and then we hope that it actually goes to where it needs to go and gets converted back into something else, and that's not always a given. So that would be a loop that goes back toward manufacturer, but most of it goes to the landfill. This is still a linear system, right? We're starting from here and we're going to there, but we're not tying it back together. But then if the system operated 100% like this, that would at least be better, okay? I'm not a big fan of linear systems because by their nature, they're unsustainable. But at least we wouldn't have plastic in the ocean. But we know something's going wrong here, right? So what is that? Well, litter is one of them. So I might even want to contrast between intentional litter of just somebody throwing something out their window versus accidental litter, like when the waste management comes and picks up my recycling on a windy day and they dump it out and it's so windy that some of the stuff winds up blowing away. I mean, that's the idea of a system that's supposed to work, right? And it does work, but things happen, right? Entropy happens. So that litter then makes its way back into terrestrial environments, back to fresh waters, out to the ocean, and there's even some direct loss right here from manufacturing to those other areas. Once they get their way onto the terrestrial landscape, they're subject to the hydrologic cycle, right? So we think of the hydrologic cycle as rain falling and it's going to erode part of the soil, which is going to enter the river, and that's going to run off and bring sediment down, to the ocean. But if it's plastic, that's just runoff into the fresh water. A lot of it is buoyant, and a lot of it's just going to pass on the surface directly to the ocean, and it's going to make its way that way. Even landfills, not the best invention, but we got to put it somewhere, I suppose. Even that isn't a foolproof, leak-proof system, because while they're compacting and stacking the trash and there's seagulls coming and rats coming and pulling everything away and the wind is blowing, that stuff is still going places, right? So we have direct leakage out of those landfills. And then if you want to think about the consumer part of this again, the laundry that you do, and this is part of the genius of Sai's title, right? The sweatpants to the garbage patch, is that when you're laundering your nice, we live in the Northwest, right? We need rugged, waterproof fabrics so that we don't die when it's cold and it gets wet. We don't wear cotton, right? We wear sensible fabric that is mostly made of polyester, right? But it is useful for when we're out in the elements. But when you wash it, you get stuff in your lint container, your lint trap, right? Well, that's just pieces of plastic. Not all of it gets in your lint trap. Some of it's coming out literally in the wash, and then it's just going out the drain. And so that stuff is making its way to the wastewater treatment. Now, it turns out wastewater treatment is actually fairly efficient at dropping that stuff out because they'll add a polymer that helps to settle some of the solids, and I'll leave that to the imagination what that is. But that does include plastics. But then what do they do with that sludge? Well, a lot of it winds up going out to fields where it's spread as fertilizer. So now you've trapped that sludge, and you might have removed that sludge from going into the water, but then you've gone and put it on a field, and then you're back to basically this point where you've got a spray field in terrestrial environments where it's subject to runoff again. There's food web transfer. We know that things that are in fresh water that then eat that plastic that get eaten by something else will then go and excrete that on the landscape to make it cycle back to the land. I hate to tell you, but that nice seafood that you enjoy, it's got plastics in it. So you then consume it and then you put it back through this system that way. And ultimately, all of these arrows point to the ocean. Now that's why we have a garbage patch, but what happens to it once it gets there? One of the things that we talk about when we talk about these box and arrow models is whether something is a source or a sink. So a leaf in the soil that's decomposing is a source of CO2. CO2 is going from the carbon in the leaf back to the atmosphere. But a plant is a sink for CO2 because it's pulling the CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting it into wood or leaf material or whatever. So here we're talking about sink in that general sense, but it also works because we're talking about whether stuff floats or sinks, okay? So there's two different terms here, really. But the ocean's specific gravity is about 1.027, and so then the question of whether plastic sinks or not depends on its specific gravity, and when that's a bigger number, it does sink. So Lego plastic happens to sink. It's got a 1.7. I have heard a rumor of this. I have maybe heard it on a newscast. I've tried to find video. I have never found it, but I heard on a newscast once that somebody in a submersible saw like literally a drift of Legos blowing across the bottom of the ocean, right? Because Lego ships that are moving stuff around, they tip capsize, stuff falls over. I don't know if it's true. It's kind of, as an adult fan of Legos, I hate to see them go to waste like that. But it would be kind of interesting to see. Now nylon, on the other hand, that's got a lighter one, so it's gonna float, right? I'm sorry. Nylon is also heavier. I was looking at those numbers. There's what's gonna be floating up there is our, most of our liquid bottles, and then polypropylene, and you can see lots of different uses up there. So that's the stuff you're gonna find floating in the ocean. So when you think about how bad the Pacific garbage patch is, just by thinking about what's floating on the surface, think about what you can't see. Because maybe half of it, or more or less, is at the bottom of the ocean already, okay? So that's how we get the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Now, you'll note this is not technically the garbage patch, because that's the land right there. And you might have heard some pretty superlative statements about this. It's an area that's twice the size of Texas. It's a floating garbage island. And those are really not quite right. It's a little bit more right to think about it as an area where the concentration of plastic in the waters is particularly high. It's estimated to have somewhere around the order of 10 to 100 kilograms per square kilometer of plastic. 92% of that is greater than 5 millimeters in size. So that would be like coolers and stuff, right? Anything that's big. But there's maybe upwards of 1.8 trillion pieces. So a lot of those pieces are really small too. Those are the microplastics. And you've probably heard about the Pacific garbage patch. And I hate to tell you this, but they're in every single ocean basin, okay? So they're in the Atlantic. There's actually 2 in the Pacific, the North and the South Pacific. There's 2 in the Atlantic. There's Indian Ocean. And they happen to accumulate in these areas where, of course, there's runoff coming from the continents, right? And there's, because of wind circulation and Coriolis effect and all this stuff that's happening at the big planetary scales, these will tend to spin. And as a result, anything that gets in there, especially that's light, will tend to get pulled into the middle. And that's where you get the big concentration of those plastics. So generally, we'll differentiate between big and small plastic. Macroplastic, which is your over 5 millimeters in size, or microplastic, which is less than that. So a lot of the problems that you've probably heard about relate to microplastic. That's the stuff that's in our diet, right? That's the stuff that we can't see very well. But knowing what we know about plastic, there's no lower size limit, right? Because remember, plastic is not a natural compound in the sense that it doesn't break down very easily, you know? So bacteria and fungi can go to work on that leaf that I keep talking about, and they can turn it into carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and sulfur, and all of those things that it turns it back into are raw materials that a plant can then use to pick up to make something else. But when plastic breaks down, it just gets smaller. The composition doesn't change, right? So we can even talk about nanoplastic, stuff that's even smaller than that, right? Creepy, sorry. Yeah, this is the point. It just gets smaller and it never really goes away. Now, of course, there are things that can break down plastic, not fast enough and not enough of them, and that's why we have a problem, right? If they could go to work on this, you know, we wouldn't see plastic in the environment because they'd already be breaking it down for us. Okay, so where do we find plastic? I'm gonna run through this, and you're gonna see a lot of things that make sense, right? Everybody's seen something like this in a city park, right? Capri Sun things, there's plastic, straws and whatnot. So there's a lot of plastic in soils. A couple of studies, just some data for you. 107,000 to 730,000 metric tons of microplastic added to farmlands in Europe and North America. That's because of that sewage sludge that I talked about. That's where a lot of that's coming from. Here was a study from Sydney, Australia that showed that if you take soils and then fractionate it and then weigh all of the constituents, that up to 6.7% of the weight of the soil is microplastic. To give you some context for that, if I collect sediments from a stream and I combust them to see how much organic matter is in that sediment, a pretty decent organic content would be 3%. You know, upwards of like 10% for a very, very organic content. So we're talking about on the order of that. And this study showed that 90%, just kind of a binomial, presence or absent, 90% of the samples on that Swiss floodplain had microplastic. Don't worry about the details of this image so much, but there's plastic in groundwater. Why would it be getting there? Well, remember, when plastic gets onto the surface, it moves. How does water get into groundwater, right? It ultimately goes from being rained on or snowmelt that percolates down, and as it's percolating down, it's picking those up and moving them down. And if it gets into a spot where that stuff can move really easily, it's gonna make its way into groundwater, and this is a really important drinking water supply. One study showed 15.2 particles per liter in groundwater. A lot of people are gonna prefer groundwater from their well in their backyard compared to municipal water, right? Because it's natural. Well, here you go. These samples showed that there was a co-occurrence of things like phosphate and chloride and triclosan. Triclosan is what makes antimicrobial soap antibacterial. Okay, it's probably not actually a great thing to be spreading around the environment, but we tend to be germ nervous, so we use a lot of those products. But this suggests that it's a sewage effluent that is a source, right? So that means it's probably like things like septic tanks, or sewage that's maybe flooding out into a floodplain and making its way into groundwaters as well. There's plastic in lakes. Whoa. These dots represent different beach cleanup surveys that were done a decade ago. And what these surveys found is that there was a lot of microplastic on these beaches. This particular study found that a lot of these were microbeads. Maybe you remember a time when microbeads, plastic microbeads, were actually added to like soaps and exfoliating things, and it was argued that it was a good beauty cleaning thing because, I don't know, I guess people have to exfoliate their skin, I don't know. But this study is what actually made that illegal, right? They said, wait a minute, these microbeads that like, and think about this, they were in toothpaste too, right? So you're worried about eating microplastics, but you're actually brushing your teeth with microplastic? Kind of crazy. So this is my first point of hope, which is that the right studies and the right public consciousness and the right education can lead to good policies, right? I don't think there's a solution to this that doesn't include policy of some kind, right? And that means that we as civic-minded people have to be engaged in that process, okay? Bringing it a little closer to home, getting closer to the Yakima River here, you'll notice that this is the number of scientific papers about plastic in either marine, in gray, or freshwater environments in black, and that most of people's thought process has been that this is an ocean problem, because that's where we see these big accumulations of garbage. But then people started thinking like, well, wait a minute, how does water get in the ocean to start with? Well, it comes from here, right? So then people started looking a little further upstream. This study is mostly to say that when we look at plastic studies, most of them are about microplastics. Most of them are in the developed world. Most of the plastic pollution problem, at least the big plastic pollution problem, is in the developing world, because that's where we send our plastics to be recycled. And they don't all get recycled. A lot of them wind up in that same river where that boy was picking out straws. Okay? So what this tells you is that when we talk about plastic as a problem, that's informed by waters that don't have as big of a plastic problem as other places do, right? So we're under-biasing our understanding of that. There's plastic in the atmosphere. This study from about 7 years ago showed that there was a microplastic concentration in Arctic snow of up to 14,000 pieces per liter. Okay, and then there's micro here in European snow, anywhere between 190 upwards of 154,000 pieces, and these are just some of the images that they found from that paper. So there's literally like that floating plastic in the ocean, because it's light and because there's a lot of wave crashing, and as those particles fragment and get smaller and smaller, you get, think about this, you've got waves crashing, you've got a hard wind, and those things get airborne, and then they just get blown around the atmosphere, right? All of this is to say that the world is awash in plastic. And one of the questions that we really have is whether this is just simply gross, but not ecologically harmful, or whether it is gross and also ecologically harmful. And if you can believe it or not, it's been surprisingly hard to get a conclusive answer about this, whether it's ecologically harmful. It's certainly gross. I think everybody could agree on that. And so I want to step through some of the things that people have found before we talk about what me and Jay Shaw, who's here, found in her thesis in the Yakima River. So we know that things can eat plastic. These samples are samples that were taken from birds in the ocean in the Pacific, taken from their guts. These are pretty big pieces of plastic. You know, if you think about how you survive as a bird in the ocean, it's like you just eat stuff that looks different than the water, right? And for most of evolutionary history, that was food. But now it's mixed with plastic, okay? These were from pelagic and demersal fish in the English Channel. And you can see anywhere between none to upwards of 60 pieces of plastic. So things are eating it, and if something eats them, they are also eating it, right? So things are, it's moving ecologically. How does this actually affect people? Well, these are a lot of weird images, and I'll boil it down to this idea of two things. The first is that when your stomach is full of plastic and not of food, you feel full, but you're not getting energy. And that's what's demonstrated in this graphic here, is that when you increase the proportion of microplastic in a diet, the total energy reserves decrease in an organism. And that is just sensible, right? That just makes sense. These images are showing that plastic can cross into the circulatory system, right? So it doesn't just stay in the digestive system. Once it gets in your body, it can move around your body as well. Is that a bad thing? Is it terrible? We don't know. I mean, people do have plastic parts in their bodies from surgeries, right? Well, plastic in nature can bioaccumulate toxins, okay? There are various human-produced toxins that are of a chemical composition that they can essentially dissolve into that plastic. So it acts as almost a sponge that'll preferentially pick those things up. And they actually get to be a very high concentration. You've probably heard of biomagnification, right? Which is this idea that some organisms at the top of the food chain have a lot of contaminants in them because of how they eat, and they concentrate that stuff. The same basically happens with these little bits of plastic. And when you do that, you wind up with a greater incidence of liver stress and tumor formation. I'm trying to remember what this was on. It might have just been a cellular response, but these are just different kinds of plastic compounds. Those are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. That's going to be a common contaminant from like exhaust and things like that. PCBs, you might recognize that. That's banned a long time ago, but it's a persistent pollutant. This is what ultimately replaced plastic as an electrical insulator until we realized how dangerous it was. And those are polybrominated diphenyl ethers, which are the flame retardants in all of the foam products that you have at home, like your pillows and your couches and things like that. Okay, and all of them have the potential to cause increased levels of liver stress and tumor formation in organisms. I'm going to skip this one because this just tells us this idea of bioaccumulation that I already talked about. And so one of the interesting things so there's been a lot of these studies about that, and then there's some marine scientists that have done a big, what we call a meta-analysis. And what they've done is they've gone through and they've tried to find all these different studies and find what are the commonalities of all of them, and what can we say about the current state of knowledge of plastics in the ocean and what it really means. And what they found is that there are lots of organismal effects that have been documented. So these are things like your tumor formation, things that affect an individual, right? But very few studies could actually detect an ecological effect, meaning some kind of an interaction in the environment where something is eating something else and something is eating that other thing. Those were very difficult to document. But these studies also did not rule out sublethal effects. So think about that organism that's eating plastic and it's getting a lower energy reserve, but it's still alive and it's not dead, right? But maybe it has less stress for autoimmune function, so it's more susceptible to disease. Maybe it's more vulnerable to predation because it doesn't have energy to make a quick sprint if it's trying to get away from something, right? Those would be kind of sublethal effects. I mean, obviously if they got caught by the predator in that example, that would be lethal, but wouldn't be due to plastic per se. They also realized that at this point there was a really poor study design. And so this often happens in science when we have a new phenomenon that we really don't know how to study, is we try to go out and make sense of it. But what's a really important question is, what methods are you using, and are they standardized across other people so that when you get your results, you can actually compare them and say, oh, I found this. You use the same method. You found that. Wow, those are similar, or those are different. Why are they different? And so one of the things that came out of this study was more of an emphasis on a tighter and reproducible study design. And what they called for as a result of this was a pressing need for robust quantitative information to predict ecological impacts. That study was redone 4 years later, and they found that negative effects were roughly equally detected. About 59% of studies showed an ecological effect, 41% did not. But what they did find is that microfibers in particular seem to be dangerous, because more studies that had an effect were associated with microfibers. So again, these are our small, really small ones, right, that are having potentially cellular issues or even crossing, bodies once they get in there. And they also similarly found that smaller particles were more likely to have an effect than larger particles. And don't forget that all of the big pieces of plastic that we see, they're all ultimately going to become a whole lot of small particles down the road. Key points from this particular study, and I just have them in quotes because they can say them better than I can. There is an overwhelming evidence for the detrimental effects of macroplastics, those are plus over 5 millimeters, to individuals, and compelling evidence for effects on populations, communities, and ecosystems. So these are more of our ecological level effects that we're talking about. For microplastics, though, the evidence is variable and seems to be context dependent. And this next one is a really important one to think about because this has implications for why recycling is not a very useful way to do something with plastic. Microplastic is not a single thing, right? Polypropylene plastic, number 5, is different than PETE, number 1, is different than HDPE, number 2. You probably recognize those numbers from the little circles on the bottom, the chasing arrows. Those are totally different chemical compounds. We call them plastic. We give them a name that suggests that they're all the same thing, but they're all different. And it actually turns out that when you recycle them and you have one bottle of number 1 plastic mixed into a whole bunch of number 2s, it contaminates the entire batch and it all has to get thrown away. Okay? So the very nature that all these different, and then you've got number 7, which is other, and that's a whole lot of different kinds of plastics, right? So there's not a singular process that can take a single stream of mixed plastic and do anything with it. So it makes it really difficult. Their judgment was that ecological effects of environmental plastics seem likely. And with that, I want to talk about data from the Yakima Basin, and are you willing to stand up or at least show yourself? This is Jay Shaw, thank you for being here. She's actually the resident plastic expert, but I think she's shy and she wanted me to talk instead. I don't know. But she and I worked together on her master's thesis up at Central. It started during COVID times, which was not very fun, and she finished in 2 years. And it is the manuscript, the scientific manuscript that originated from that is currently under consideration. So we hope that will lead to a publication soon. But she had a really good idea to try to really do a methodical study of plastic in rivers, because as you saw from those other slides, at least when we started this, they were unusual. And so what she decided to do was, here's our Yakima Basin, right? There's Snoqualmie Pass up there, all the way down to the Tri-Cities. And each of these stars represented one of her sample sites. So she picked 9 spots all the way up and down the river and wanted to look at plastic that's in the water column. So in other words, what's being floating downstream. Plastic that's in what we call the benthos. So what plastic is stuck to the bottom, right? So in the Yakima River, it's mostly rocks. And that means that it's plastic that's stuck to the stuff that is stuck to the rocks, right? The stuff that you slip on when you go out into the river, right? And then she also wanted to then look at what are in the insects. Because one of the big questions is, okay, we know there's plastic everywhere. That's not particularly novel. One of the things that's been harder to document is who's actually eating it. And if we know anything about the Yakima River, we know how important fish are in the river. We know that the insects in the bottom of the river are the really important link between the algae and the other leaves that are decomposing in the river that are helping those fish grow. And if the insects have plastic and the fish eat the insects, it's not too much of a leap of the imagination to think that we've got plastic moving all the way up through this food web into the fish that are really important for recreation and subsistence in our area. And so these are just some highlights of the result. Now remember, her thesis defense was 50 minutes. I'm just going to give you a couple of slides to give you the flavor. This graphic shows microplastics per liter differentiated by whether they were fibers or fragments. And this shows that even in Site 1, which was literally Gold Creek, which is that last creek that you drive across that's draining into the reservoir, right? Who would expect plastic up there? There's not much up there. Well, that was one of the higher amounts of plastic that she found. And then fragments were always a little bit lower, but there were always more fibers compared to fragments. And every single, maybe all but one sample had fibers in them, somewhere on the order of 2.5 upwards to 5 pieces per liter. But also these lines tell you that it was also really variable, right? Some had none, but some had a lot. right? So imagine then that you're in the river, and if you could actually see the plastic floating downstream, that means that every liter that flows past you, right, a liter is about that, right, has got 2 to 5 pieces of plastic in it, maybe upwards to 10, maybe none, but usually 2 to 5, okay? So she found plastic in 97% of the water, 96% of the biofilm, that's the stuff on the bottom of the river, right? And in 68% of the insects. Now this is admittedly not a very beautiful figure, no offense. This was one the reviewers told us to scrap because it was not very beautiful by their opinion. But this shows you the fibers per insect, and then the insects are colored different things. So a betidae is a mayfly. You probably heard that name. Chironomidae is a midge. They're really important for fish because they turn over really quickly. They get lots of generations per year and they grow really fast. They're a really important food source for fish. The light gray circle is Glossosomatidae. That would be, you probably know, hopefully you know caddisflies. Caddisflies are insects that make often a stone case, but they have different materials they make a case out of. Glossosomatids are the ones that are like a little turtle shell that's stuck to a rock. And they're also the Mother's Day caddis. So if you're a fly fisherman and you know the Mother's Day caddis, those are Glossosomatids. And then perloded is the open circle. That's a stonefly. You know, those will be the big casings that you'll often see, at least in the upper Yakima near Ellensburg, you'll see them in the fall, like in September, they crawl out of the river and they break through their final, you know, their molt, and then they get their wings and they fly. They're great. If you don't know much about aquatic insects, you should learn more. And I can find somebody to come talk to you about that. The point being here is that 2/3 of insects had fibers, again, averaging 1 to 2, you know, maybe not many, but maybe upwards of 5 as well. These are little tiny things and little tiny guts. That's a lot of plastic in those guts. Now, one of the things that Jay wanted to think about was, okay, 2 pieces per liter. Does that sound like a lot or a little? It's kind of hard to tell. I think one of the big questions we have to know is how many liters are in the Yakima River, right? So assuming that the samples that she collected are average, which is not necessarily a good assumption, we just did some basic math. And we said, well, if we have 2 pieces per liter, and there's 57,000 liters per second flowing down the Yakima River at summer, that means that there's 171,000 pieces of plastic flowing down the river every second, okay? So stand by the side of the river and count 1 Mississippi, and all the water that flowed past you has 171,000 pieces of plastic in it. Every second, every minute, every hour, every day. 24/7, 365. So then what about in the benthos? Remember, she also found stuff on the rocks, okay? So we had to make some assumptions. The width of the river changes, you know, depending on whether you're high or low in the river. We went down to a place in the canyon. We measured on Google Earth. It's about 40 meters wide. And if you extrapolate her math up, in the Yakima River, at a place where it's 40 meters wide, there are 4,506,000,000 pieces of plastic on the riverbed between the city of Ellensburg and Umtanum Canyon, which is about midway down the river. Now remember, that assumes that the averages that we got are accurate, and they may or may not be. But imagine this, it could be more. Who's to say that we have a really high estimate? Maybe we have a really low estimate. We don't know. It's pretty crazy. So there's where your sweatpants are going, right? When you do laundry. That's depressing. I want to try to shift to a slightly more upbeat thing, which is what can be done. There is a group called Ocean Cleanup, and they think that they can remove 90% of ocean plastic by 2040. And they've got this really clever design where there's this gigantic boom And then there's this kind of parachute thing, and the wind blows the boom in this direction, but the parachute kind of slows it down. And what that means is stuff on the surface moves faster than the boom is moving. And so the wind is just going to push it into that boom. And then it's got some kind of computer triggers in it so that when it's full, these things collapse on themselves and they form a circle. And it'll send out a signal, and then they can come and they can pick it up. You can actually go to their website. You can get recycled jewelry made out of this plastic, and it helps to support their efforts. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. Well, let me ask you, from what we talked about, just a general audience for the crowd, let's assume they can do this. They can clean up all ocean plastic by 2040, and we do nothing else. Is that going to solve the problem? Until we stop putting plastic down the drain and using it in consumer materials and throwing it out, this is going to happen forever until essentially we run out of oil to make plastic out of, right? So this is nice as an idea to clean the problem that seems the most immediate for people, but it's not a long-term solution. What you really want to do is stop it before it gets in the ocean to start with. But they're pretty clever people. They've thought about that. Dang it. Sorry, I need to put this back on. I'm not used to having these attached to me, so I'm being kind of clumsy with them. Sorry. They figure if they go to the most plastic polluted rivers in the world and they put this device in here, which is basically the river is coming this direction, and if you know about rivers, they kind of tend to bounce from shore to shore like that. That means that most of the stuff is going to get caught in this net, and then they clean that net out periodically, and then that prevents the plastic from getting into the ocean. So this is better, right? We're getting a little further up. Yeah, a quick question? That is correct. So if you could not hear the question on the live stream, the point was they're only cleaning macroplastic, and that is 100% true. Because these nets, if they were micro nets, the river wouldn't go through it, right? They would jam up. So yeah, that is correct. Most of the microplastic in the ocean is derived from the macroplastic that is breaking down. So that's good in the oceanic sense, but there's still a lot of microplastic that's produced on the landscape that this would not do anything about. So that is a very good point. I always like to highlight this young gentleman. So for people who think that young people aren't doing anything these days, here's a young person who used a ferrofluid. I can only guess what that means. That means it's some kind of liquid iron, I suppose. And he was able to remove 87% of microplastics from wastewater. So this would be better to the prior comment, right? If you could do this where microplastics are produced, you get rid of them before they get into the ocean. That would only work, though, in a system that is part of a municipal system. That doesn't work from plastic that you find in the parking lot that winds up breaking down and getting into the river on its own, right? And one of the things that I mentioned is that, now I'm not a policy expert, but I do think that policy is probably the only way that we get out of this, is we need laws, whether they are local, state, national, or international, that help us get out of this mess. Remember I showed you how much plastic is being produced every year. The plastics industry wants to triple that number in the next 2 decades because there's big economies like China and India and Brazil that are rapidly industrializing, and they're becoming developed. And developed societies want convenience items, and convenience items are plastic. The plastic industry, and this is only maybe slightly conspiratorial. I don't have my tinfoil hat currently, but there are people that would argue that the plastics industry is the fossil fuels ace in the hole for if there is climate change regulation that limits the use of petroleum for transportation. Now, they still have a market for that petroleum. They always say follow the money, right? So it kind of makes sense. Obviously, there's some ridiculous things here, like this plastic-wrapped Coca-Cola, right? I don't know that I've ever seen that, or peeled and wrapped oranges when oranges already have a probably good peel on them. But there are things we can do. Is a plastic straw ban enough? Honestly, it's probably a start, you know. Maybe there's better things to do. I know in Ellensburg, they just now pay for plastic bags, you know, so when you get a plastic bag in the store, you have to pay for it, and then that does change consumer behavior. One of the things that would be really helpful is if we could invent a single stream plastic recycling method. The fact that we haven't yet, I think, shows us how difficult that is, right? Because we're dealing with different kinds of plastics, different compounds. Then you just put it all in one place and it goes somewhere, and if they're doing their job right, then it at least doesn't make its way in the environment. I would argue that one of the places this starts is with how we think about plastic. And this is where I'm gonna try to back out just a little bit. We have to start thinking about plastic in the environment in the same way that we think about water in the environment and rock in the environment. Because even though I just spent a whole lot of time telling you that plastic moves in a straight line, it actually doesn't. And I'll show you in a second why that is, okay? But water moves in a circle, right? Evaporation from the ocean, rain on the landscape, washes everything back to the ocean. Rocks do that. You get subduction on the Juan de Fuca, you get, you know, ash out of Mount St. Helens, right? And then that erodes, and it winds its way back into the Juan de Fuca subduction zone. Same with carbon cycle. We need to start thinking about a plastic cycle. Now, I parked and I walked in, and I just parked not closest but the next row out, and I found these two pieces of plastic in the parking lot. One is styrofoam and one is Diablo Double Dare You. That must be from Taco Bell, right? Some kind of hot sauce. If I didn't pick this up, it was gonna rain hard enough that this is gonna go down a storm drain, it's gonna go in the Yakima River. But let me ask you, when you see stuff like this in an urban environment or in a parking lot, does it look out of place to you? It looks normal, right? Especially in Western ways of thinking, there's this idea that humans and civilization are over here and nature is over here, and those places are different. And when you go to nature, you go to the Alpine Lakes Wilderness or you go to Yosemite National Park, right? You don't think of the parking lot as nature, but it is. I mean, there's not much nature there, but there's weeds that grow, there's plants that grow. A lot of them are ornamental. But if we didn't plant the ornamental ones, there'd be weeds there. I guarantee you there's little mice and stuff that come out at night. You know, you can see that after a snowfall, a small snowfall, you can see all their tracks. So these things that seem perfectly normal in an urban area that we think of as not part of nature are 100% connected to nature, because the minute they hit the storm drain, they're in the river. So we have to kind of think like that. Once I started thinking like that, and I saw, like, I like to walk to work, it's about a half hour. I see plastic every block somewhere. And when I can, I just try to pick it up and put it in the garbage. You know, I'm not gonna stop the garbage patch from happening, but it's not nothing. I will put this in the garbage when I'm done after this demonstration. But remember when I said that plastic doesn't actually move in a straight line like I tried to convince you of? Check this out. There were some scientists that went to this island off the coast of Brazil, and they found this strange rock on the ocean, right on the beach. And they did not know what it was, and they took a sample of it, and they came back to the lab, and it was plastic. And what had happened is there was plastic that was on the bottom of the ocean that got pushed into a place that was just hot enough that it melted, and then when it oozed back out onto the surface, it made this deposit, just like the rock cycle. Now, that's still plastic, okay? This is not recycled in the same sense that a rock is recycled. It's just melted down and re-oozed onto the surface, right? It's not broken down in that biological sense. We've already got plastic moving through these big global level carbon cycle, water cycle type material flows that are interacting with them in exactly the way that we would expect it to. And it's weird. And I would just end with this question. Why are we creating such durable and indestructible material for such mundane uses, like holding a cup of coffee? Like that, if you think about it from that perspective, it is just literally insane. So I give you that, hopefully that's something that causes you to think a little bit. I think the most important things that we do right now, starting tonight, is you can change your behavior. You can change the choices that you make. You can talk to your family. You can talk to your friends. You can maybe ask them to skip a straw or whatever it is. Pick one small thing. One of the things that I did is I stopped getting the liquid laundry soap, because they now make those little strips that just dissolve. And then the package is paper, which recycles, and the strip is this dried soap that rehydrates, and then it's done, right? I mean, probably not done. There's something, I'm sure we'll probably find it's some terrible thing down the road, but now I'm not throwing out big jugs of plastic, right? So there are some solutions out there. Maybe I'm an optimist, but it starts with people. It starts with conversations. It starts with people in your social circle, and that builds up to local government, and it builds up to state government, and you can actually make some choices there and changes. And with that, I would like to thank a whole lot of the people that have helped to make this possible for me. Many of these people are my students. Emily Bland, Lucy Boston, Josh Goebel, Erica McKenzie, Rachel Medalia, Will Raymond, and of course Jay Shaw. Thank you for coming tonight. And then lots of different funding support that I got to help this. And I would love to answer any questions that you have. Yes. So, Sai, there was a question right over here. I think Sai is going to bring the microphone around. So.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Thank you, Clay. That was excellent.
Oh, cool. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome.
You hear about different bacteria being developed for breaking down plastic because the problem feels so overwhelming.
Yes.
Do you want to comment on that as a possibility?
There is actually, I'm glad you asked, because here's one right here. This one in particular is one that I know about. This was a microbe that was isolated from just a microbial biofilm that was growing in a plastic recycling facility in Japan, as I recall. And what they found is that this bacterium had actually evolved an enzyme that would completely break down PET, to carbon dioxide, right? That's what I'm talking about. This is what literally turns it back into its raw material. Now, there's a couple caveats to this, right? It would probably need to be done at this point under controlled conditions. One of the things about bacteria is that they have notoriously versatile metabolisms. Unlike us, like we have to eat carbon and we have to exhale CO2, they can sometimes take a lot of different energy sources in. And I have to imagine that polyethylene is not the best energy source. So they're probably only going to be using this under the most extreme conditions when there's not something else available. But to your point, this does hold promise if we want to go down the road of trying to create an industrial process that uses bacteria for this advantage. One other caveat, and I don't want to rain on this parade because it's kind of good, that's only one type of plastic, right? There's a lot of different types of plastic out there. It's interesting to note that like wastewater treatment uses bacteria that are in the environment, right? The operators don't add their own bacteria in, they just naturally cultivate it with what's there. And so if we adopted a similar process by naturally cultivating this, basically optimizing the conditions for what we want, which would be basically starving it of all the other good stuff, we can probably do it. The next question are rates, how fast does it work? Is it going to be able to handle the number of PET bottles produced every day? There's lots of different questions like that. But this does hold promise for sure. Yeah, so thank you for that question.
You were talking
Oh, sorry, he was going over there with the microphone. Yeah, we'll get you next.
I was wondering, because you talked a lot about like using straws and plastic bags, like how they're single use and that's detrimental to the environment, and I completely agree with that. I was wondering, because I remember from a few years ago, like the plastic bag versus the paper bags, in regards to preserving the amount of fresh water we have in our environment.
Yeah.
I was wondering what you had to say on the trade-offs of those.
Cloth bag. Now, it's a good point, right? Because what you're getting at is the idea of what we call a life cycle analysis, right? So production of one plastic bag takes a certain amount of water, it takes a certain amount of raw material, it produces a certain amount of pollution. Same with the production of a plastic bag. You've got forestry impacts of the plastic or the paper bag. You've got mining impacts of the plastic bag. Even if you switch to cloth, cloth is usually made out of cotton. Cotton's a very water-intensive crop, uses a lot of fertilizer, a lot of pesticides. Lots of cotton is grown in other parts of the world that don't have as good environmental regulation as we do in the United States, so that means more pesticide and things like that. I don't have a good answer for you, unfortunately, but you're thinking exactly along the right line. You have to add up all of those different impacts and then from there make a decision about what's best. I did see one analysis. I cannot comment on whether it was the analysis or if it was the best analysis. And it showed that if you were to get a cloth bag and use it 100 times, that it would offset the waste produced by a plastic or a paper bag. So that would suggest that if you got a cloth bag and you were good at using it a lot, then that would mean that you would probably minimize that use. It is true that like in a world with over, what are we at, 8.5 billion people right now, everything that everybody does has an impact, right? And even if it's a small impact, when you multiply it by 8.5 billion, it winds up being a big thing. So I would kind of leave you with that. I don't have a good answer. If you get something back to Cy, I can find that and I can send it back to you through him, and you can look at that yourself. But you're talking about a life cycle analysis, and they'll all be different, I'm guessing. But yeah, and then you had a question, sir.
I was really intrigued by your discussion about the subduction of plastic. Does anyone know, I mean, petroleum is basically plant parts that are subjected to a great deal of pressure and heat.
Yeah.
Does anybody know how much pressure and heat it would take to convert our typical plastics back into a petroleum-like product?
Yeah.
And is there any evidence that as you're subducting that stuff, some of it gets carried down far enough so that you're basically turning it back into petroleum?
Right. I don't have the answer, but I bet somebody does. Are there any geologists in the crowd? It would probably be if you're a geologist, it'd probably be a relatively simple computation about pressure and heat and things like that that would essentially convert it back to a liquid form. You know, you have other things like this plastic Diablo, the Double Dare You, is actually plastic lined with aluminum, right? So you get into questions about what are the overall compounds, and then when it does melt down, it's not just petroleum, there's different additives in there, what happens to them. But I suspect that a geologist who knew what they were doing could probably go to a subduction zone and find a pool of liquid plastic somewhere down there. Because that slide that I showed you here shows you that it's happening, and this can't be the only place. That would be too weird. That's just not my specialty, so I can't give you the answers, but I think you're on the right track in that I'm sure that is happening somewhere. And I bet 100 million years from now, somebody's gonna find all this stuff, and they're gonna be like, man, look at all this oil under here. Huh, some of it has foil in it, and some of it's like really hot, you know? So anyway, Alex.
Yeah, Clay, we just talked about the million-year solution.
Yeah.
And thinking about the 10-year solution, and you touched on it, and I remember seeing maps of sources of plastic to the ocean, and it's
Yeah.
overwhelming rivers coming out of less developed, highly urbanized, less developed places, Southeast Asia, et cetera. Is it fair to say in the short term, while we're looking at longer term, how do we make things differently, that the single biggest thing you could do is help build better garbage management systems in a lot of developing areas You know, we're used to most of our plastic does go to the landfill, and the litter is, I don't know whether it's these days 5% or 1%, but it's relatively small
Yeah.
compared to other places. And do you have a sense of, how significant just that getting people a garbage can and a place to go dump it that actually gets sealed over is?
I'm going to hesitate to give numbers, but I have seen numbers. I want to say it was on the order of like 80% of the plastic in the ocean is estimated to come from a very few hotspots, just like you said. And so that would imply that at least in terms of if the marine plastic is the focus, that would, if we can fix those things in the way that you mentioned it, that would at least prevent more from going in, right? And then we got to think about what do we do with the stuff that's there and all the other things. One of the things, some of the crazy international connections that are tied in is that some of the plastic recycling that we do actually winds up in those areas, and then that's what winds up in their rivers. So I hesitate to say, and I know that you weren't saying this, but I hesitate to say, well, you know, if only Indonesia could fix that river, that'd be great, because Indonesia's contracted to take our plastic, you know, to do that. But yeah, things like that, having good governance that would lead to good public infrastructure like that would be worthwhile, because we can see the effects of it here. Where we have good governance and good infrastructure, we see fewer of those kinds of problems. So that's where definitely those policies targeting those high impact areas would have a big effect. And then you kind of work backwards from there, right? That's not going to do anything with the microfibers in the river. Then we think about other things that way. That's where this kind of science is important, to figuring out where is it coming from. Because if we just call it plastic, it means different things. It means different compounds. Maybe the microfibers are different than the macroplastics. Maybe the stuff in the ocean from the rivers is different than what's happening locally here in the Yakima. So there's those different kind of nuances that come to play. Yeah.
So with the nets to capture the plastic, have they thought about the various animals that could get caught in those nets?
I don't know how widespread those nets are. They seem, frankly, like more trouble than not. As a person who's done a lot of filtering of river water in my scientific research, you know, river water is pretty dirty stuff. Even if it's dirty with stuff that should be there that's not plastic, nets fill up really quickly. And so my guess is that what they've got would be more of a boom than a net. In other words, it's probably floating on the surface and catching a lot of the really floating stuff, which isn't doing much for the stuff that's moving on the bottom because it's heavier. That'd be my guess, because the thought of draping a net in a river that you wouldn't have to manage like every hour for the rest of your life, you know, that's just not gonna be a sustainable solution. So without knowing the details, my guess is that's a boom instead of a net. Yeah, the nets really don't work. I mean, you could even think about a situation like, oh, we want to get these microplastics out of the ocean. Why don't we just get a real fine net and go through it all, right? Which would work, but it would also get all of the amphipods and, you know, all the other zooplankton and the krill and all the other things. So that's not even really going to work. You know, that type of filtration is not really the answer, because there's a lot of non-target stuff that you pick up. I hope that got to your answer, or to your question. Okay, great.
One, I mean, I'm sitting right next to Jay, so I could ask her, but
Yeah.
this feels like her study needs to be a continuation. So there needs to be another return to the Yakima, probably to see if there's any change over time.
Cool.
If we're getting worse.
Yeah, ask her if she wants another master's degree.
Yeah. So I think that, but also when it comes to policy, I'm a local teacher here, so I think a lot of this has to be communicated in the sense of place. So
Absolutely.
like bringing this to like middle school curriculum, what I teach life science and geology. And so do we have the ability to take this and bring it down to a high school level, or use our potential?
That's a good question. I don't know how high school and middle school curricula how it originates and how it winds up in your hands, and how much personal control you have versus district control of that.
Yeah, I think Open SciEd is probably the best curriculum currently.
Okay.
Yakima School District doesn't use it,
Okay.
but I know a lot of curriculum around the state is using it, and depending on how the legislature wants to push science standards going forward, because we are reassessing those with NGSS, even though we're one of the states that wrote it.
Okay.
But Open SciEd has been it's notorious for using local studies and everything else. So
Okay.
having your study and reaching out, and I can find who the person is. When I was in Bellingham, that's what we were using.
Yeah.
We were like a test group for it. So there's definitely curriculum writers that
Okay.
use that, and the whole point is the sense of place. So
Yeah.
keeping
Well,
your stuff as local as possible.
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind that's actually probably, depending on what kind of materials you have, if you had a basic microscope and some dishes and filters and a net, you could go out. I mean, you don't even need that. Go get some Morton's table salt and look at it under a microscope, and you'll find plastic in it. So that might be a useful and doable thing for like an independent a little project about maybe the water cycle or whatever, however it fits into the standards that you're using, of having students collect samples, or maybe they design a study and maybe you get the samples if getting off campus is a problem. But they can, if you have microscopes and filters, Jay would be happy to be in the classroom with you to help you figure out how to look at those. Yeah. And honestly, in the same offer, if you want to get some material back to me through Sci, I would be happy to send the protocols that Jay used. There are some considerations that you have to take because there's just literally plastic everywhere if you want to really isolate it. But it's pretty eye-opening. It's surprisingly easy if you have a microscope to see just how much plastic there is, out there. And then the other thing I might add. I don't do science ed at Central. There's a different department for that. But this seems like something where there might be an interesting collaboration where there's a student that you and them could work together to create a module that was something that was, maybe the water cycle and plastic, or like however it kind of fits into the overall scheme of things, and you can pilot that out. I mean, I'm sure that there would be a collaboration that we could do that way. So yeah, definitely come back to me through Sci.
So to follow up to that, so you're saying that plastic is pretty easy to identify just under magnification?
Some plastics really stick out because like when you get a sample from the bottom of the river and then you look at it and there's a bright red fiber in it, like there's no bright red fibers like that in nature, right? So the fibers get to be pretty easy, especially because the colors that we wear, where they come from, tend to be quite bright. There are some, red fibers, blue fibers, orange fibers. Those are not things that you find in nature. There are definitely fibers that can be a little tricky, and I would defer to Jay on that because she's the one who destroyed her eyesight looking through the microscopes at a zillion samples and getting a handle. But once you, it doesn't take a whole lot to see it to be like, wait, that's not normal. That's a bright red thing, and everything else is brown in here. Like, what is that doing there? So, and then, obviously like a foam pellet, like this is a styrofoam cup, so that foam pellet would be super obvious. Yeah, some are a little trickier.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think we've got time for one,
There's one over here.
possibly two more questions.
So I know this research has been going on for a while, like fighting against microplastics, and I was just wondering if there has been like any significantly different changes in the population.
On the population of,
Just like of microplastics.
of,
Yeah, like where, like for example, like cities, states.
gotcha, yeah. I'm trying to think of like this person, sorry to catch your name, but they suggested coming back and doing this again. I don't know, I can't think of a study off the top of my head that's been a repeat study where they go back to the same place and do the same thing and then do like a change through time. My guess would be that plastic amount would tend to correlate pretty highly with human population, right? Because plastic only originates in nature through human actions, right? So the more people, the more plastic. So I would bet that if we did, like, say, starting with this study that Jay did, and we do a 20-year study in the same place, and we look at human population in the Yakima Basin and all those plates, I bet that you would find a pretty close correlation between increases in population, increases in plastic, or decreases in population and decreases in plastic. Or maybe a more fine way to say it would be human use, right? Because especially up at Gold Creek, nobody lives there, right? I mean, there's obviously people that live in Snoqualmie Pass. There's people that live in that beautiful valley that kind of goes off away. But the vast majority of the people who visit are wearing their nice weather durable clothing and their ski gear and everything else, and they're going hiking, and that's where it's coming from, right? Is that high human use. So does that get at your question, or did I misunderstand? To detect plastics or to change plastics? To change. I would say that depends on the population's willingness to do things differently. Like, you know, my observation is that people don't like change. So asking people to do something different is hard. That would, I think, be the biggest factor. But if you had a small or a large community that wanted to try to make a difference maybe locally because they're going to see a difference, I bet in that case you could get them to sign up, because the next time they go out and they see the problem, it would be fixed. This actually kind of brings me to an interesting point that I didn't bring up. In our neck of the woods, it's more of a microplastic problem, right? Because if you saw coolers floating down the Yakima at the rate you saw microplastics floating down the Yakima, wouldn't you be at city council like yelling up a blue streak, telling them to like get people under control? I think you probably would, because it'd be really obvious. Microplastics aren't obvious. They're there. If you all had microscopes for eyeballs, you could see them, but we don't. And that's where it gets tricky, right? That's where the education comes in. And that's where probably this sense of place becomes really powerful, because when people can see it with their own eyes, they'll believe it. I bet it's still a little bit of a leap of faith, like, really? There's 70 billion pieces of plastic in there? Maybe. I mean, I think you should be skeptical, right? Who am I? But you can't see it, so it's a little harder, you know. We did a really good job in our country getting pollution under control in the 70s because people were throwing stuff out their window in their car, you know, and it was disgusting. And now people are better about putting stuff in the garbage, which is good. Now we don't notice it as much. Microplastics you can't see. So I think that's where that also ties in, right? So.
I have one more question, Clay, hopefully to take us home, maybe on a positive note.
Okay.
Maybe
This wasn't positive?
Maybe a very, very gently positive note is if the making of the plastic is a huge part of the problem, you know, creating so much super durable material. Mm-hmm. Are there many positive stories or developments out there about making just much more biodegradable stuff?
As far as I know, they have experimented with plastic made from natural materials, right? Like cornstarch comes to mind as one. My concern is that if you're adding stuff to make it plastic, is it still functionally plastic, even if it started as cornstarch? And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, a paper bag is a nice, you know, biodegradable thing, but we got away from that because we didn't want to, you know, deforest quite so much. You know, we used to do things differently, right? Before we had plastic bags, people still got groceries home. I was not alive then, but it happened. Part of it might be rethinking the way that we do things, you know, to make it a little bit more, I mean, I know that this is not an option for lots of people, but I have made some personal lifestyle changes. One of them is that I made my garden bigger so that I don't have to go to the store for groceries during the summer. And I've already seen lettuce starting to grow. So like in a month or so, I'll probably be shifting to eating most of my veggies from the garden. That means I'm getting fewer, those really thin plastic bags for lettuce and stuff like that. I mean, that's not practical for everybody because some people maybe can't garden, maybe they live in an apartment, maybe it's just bad on their back or whatever. I mean, I don't know. It's hard. And I know you're trying to send us positive. It is hard. I don't know how you make something that is a package that is supposed to be durable also biodegradable, because once that package gets wet, it's going to start to degrade, right? And so I don't know where that mix is. You might remember in the 90s, I think it was, when everybody was really big on photodegradable plastic, right? We recognized plastic was a problem then and litter was a problem. So chemists were like, we're going to make it photodegradable. Like, great, sunlight's going to hit it when it's on the side of the road and it's going to break down and disappear, right? But it just gets smaller. It doesn't break down. So photodegradable is not really degradable. It's just photofragmentation more than anything. It's tricky. I'll tell you what, if there was an easy solution that would make money, we'd already be there. And we're not there because it is a hard problem and it's going to probably take a lot of investment before we get there. And that's unfortunate, but if I'm going to leave you on a high note, it's going to be like teach people and be heard, right? That's how I can't think of a movement for change in our country that did not start with communities, talking to people, and making noise. I think that's the answer.
Right on. Clay, thank you very much.
Cool, thank you.